So another in the line of screencasts about macroeconomic equilibrium. In this case, we're looking at the Keynesian model of the macroeconomy. And remember that Keynes argued that prices in the factor markets, well, all prices for that matter, but prices in factor markets don't necessarily change as quickly as a classical economist thinks that they do. So in other words, when aggregate demand changes, say shifts from aggregate demand 2 to aggregate demand 1, I should get my hand out of the way, aggregate demand 2 to aggregate demand 1, prices don't actually come down. And he said that the reason for that is that a lot of prices in factor markets are actually quite inflexible because market forces don't work on them to the extent we think that they might. For example, wages are often bargained in a contract, and in a contract might be for a year or 2 or 5, and wages cannot fall that easily. Same thing with, say, oil. Oil is often bought on a futures contract. What it means is that the price of oil is negotiated sometimes like 6 months before the oil is actually delivered to the customer. And you can sort of look at all products in factor markets and see similar scenarios. Sometimes, going back to the case of wages, sometimes employers don't want to cut wages of workers because they don't want to hurt worker morale and then therefore end up with reduced productivity from those workers. In any case, because prices don't fall, factor prices don't fall that quickly, when aggregate demand contracts, we don't see a contraction in overall overall prices. We do see a contraction in GDP, but we don't see a contraction in prices. So what does that mean in this model? Well, Keynes believed that we actually had an aggregate supply curve that was shaped like a big fishhook, or L-shaped if you want to call it that. That what the macroeconomy actually was, the aggregate supply curve in the macroeconomy is actually made up of 3 regions. A region where resources were underemployed, a region where resources were reaching full employment and therefore increased employment had an inflationary effect on prices, and then a region of full employment where all resources were being used to their fullest capacity. This is equal to long-run aggregate supply, analogous to long-run aggregate supply in the classical model. So when resources are underemployed, say there is unemployment in the labor force, or storefronts are not being rented, or factories are not operating at capacity. When aggregate demand increases, say it goes from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2, suppliers will expand output from GDP 1 to GDP 2 in order to meet that demand, but they don't necessarily find that the prices will go up in the factor markets, because when you hire more workers, if a lot of workers are unemployed to start with, those workers are going to get hired up, and it would not put pressure on wages to go up. If you went down into downtown and you wanted to rent a store to open up a coffee shop, for example, if there was 5 or 6 empty stores, your desire to rent a store is not going to push up rents all over town. But if every store was already full, the only way you're getting one is if you offer a higher rent. So when we're in the underemployed region of the aggregate supply curve, increases in aggregate demand will lead to increases in output, but not increases in price. As factors of production start to get fully employed, when they start to get out here in this, what we call this inflationary region, then we'll see that increases in aggregate demand, like say from 83 to 84, will lead to increases in output, but also increases in price level. We can see that on the price axis, but we can also see it here, right? This is an increase in both output and prices. Not only do we see increases in prices, but we see smaller effects on GDP, because we're starting to reach full employment beyond which we cannot produce. Once we're out to 85, actually all shifts in aggregate demand are only inflationary. There is no increase in output. We see the jump from GDP 4 to GDP 5 is almost nothing here. But this jump in inflation from GDP 4, the price level here to here, is a huge jump in prices. So again, we have a region where resources are underemployed. Resources here are underemployed, and any increase in aggregate demand will lead to increases in GDP, but not prices. Out here, we find that resources are beginning to be fully employed, so increases in aggregate demand, say from 83 to 84, will lead to increases in output, but also some increases in prices. And then finally, when we get up to full employment, shifts in aggregate demand are almost completely inflationary. So the Keynesian believes that you can actually manage GDP levels by focusing on aggregate demand. So you can do things like cut personal income taxes to stimulate consumption spending, or a stimulus package from the government, building roads or something like that, can have a positive effect on GDP and not have an inflationary effect on prices. And again, this is because Keynes believed, and then therefore Keynesian economists believe, that prices in factor markets are often slow to respond to changing macroeconomic conditions. In this model here, one thing that economists look for is the beginnings of inflation as a sign that the economy is close to full capacity. In other words, when there's no inflation at all, economists wonder if maybe growth can be expanded. Because let's say we're at GDP 2 and there's no inflation. We might think we're at full employment, but the no inflation part tells us that maybe we're not quite at full employment. The move from GDP 3 or AD3 to AD4, GDP 3 to GDP 4, we see we get growth, but we also get inflation. In this moment right here, the economist says we're nearing capacity. When they start to see price accelerate, when inflation begins to accelerate at this point here in the curve, that's an indication that the economy is approaching full employment. In fact, if the prices start to jump through the roof, some economists argue that what you need to do is you actually need to contract aggregate demand. You need to raise taxes, or more likely raise interest rates, because there's not enough growth possible to tolerate this much inflation. This move from here, AD4 to AD5, would be almost purely inflationary. In fact, if inflation is this high, if we see the price levels this high, some economists would argue for a contractionary fiscal policy. In other words, let's cut aggregate demand so that we can bring prices back down. So the Keynesian model, again, the key difference between the Keynesian model and the classical model is that in the Keynesian model, managing aggregate demand is actually very effective in both what we call fiscal policy, which is affecting spending by consumers or government, or monetary policy, which is changing interest rates to affect investment spending, or also consumption spending for that matter too. Interest rates affect consumption spending as well. But you can manage the amount of output in the economy, and you can manage inflation. The classical economist thinks that you can't do either of those things by manipulating aggregate demand. The only thing you can do is increase and shift long-run aggregate supply. Now, the Keynesian believes we're not stuck with a supply curve that looks like this. You can expand the full employment region of the aggregate supply curve. You can grow that out to the right with investments in technology or human capital, or really any capital. They don't believe that this is permanent. They just don't believe that there's an automatic correcting feature in the way that the classical economists did or do.